I'm Hayward Zwerling, and I had a career as an endocrinologist and a software developer. But when I retired, it was like, what am I going to do? So I started to dig, like anybody who's trained in, academia, I started to dig into the medical literature. And what you're going to see is what I developed from my research. I'm going to talk about what I call my strategic retirement plan, and I'm going to give you the science behind that. Then we're going to talk about how do you modify the strategic retirement plan based on your own personal preferences. We'll take a break, and then I'll talk to you about what's called the tactical plan, which is how do we actually implement this strategic retirement plan objectives. So I retired at 68, and the first thing I started to do was look at the life tables and say, okay, how long do I have, and, and so forth. And I'm basically healthy, so I probably have 2.5 decades left, and I probably have a decade or a decade and a half of what's called disability-free lifestyle. And I'm going to show you a calculator later where you can calculate approximately how many years you have before health problems really start to crash in on you. So I started my research, um, and the first thing is if you Google, how do you retirement, what to do, the first thing that'll come up is the stages of retirement. And the first stage of retirement is basically an extended vacation. And everybody, when they retires in the beginning, say, "This is fantastic. I can sleep as late as I want. There's no responsibilities and so forth." That's stage one. Stage two is disenchantment. People start to get bored with this idea of perpetual vacation. So stage two is boredom, and people start to wonder, what am I going to do? A friend of mine said, who's a good golfer, who lives in Florida, says, I can't play golf more than 3 days a week. What the hell am I going to do with the rest of my life? The other thing that starts to happen in stage two is people who are in a position of authority or power will start to will immediately recognize that they have no more authority anymore in the world. People will start missing their friends from work. We'll talk about that a little bit later on. And that's stage two. In stage three, some people will go on and say, okay, I need to come up with a new plan. In doing that, what you start to have to ask yourself is, what do you really want as opposed to what you think you want? What could you be doing as opposed to what you should be doing? Who you were, who you are, who you were, and who you think you're going to be. And for those people who go through stage three and start exploring options by prototyping different activities, some of them will find something that clicks. And that will become their new purpose in life. And once you get to that stage, you have a reason to get up out of bed every day, and the rest of your life is all set. But not everybody gets to that stage. So the first study I want to talk about when I started doing my research is the Harvard Study of Adult Development. For those of you who don't know what it is, it's a remarkable study. 1938, it started out with some Harvard male undergraduates, because at that point it was only male undergraduates. In fact, Gail's father was in the study, as was John F. Kennedy was in the study. And that study started to basically look at how people developed over time. At the same time, unbeknownst to the group of researchers who were doing that study, there was another study going on that was run out of Harvard Law School, where they were looking at low-income teenagers trying to figure who haven't got into legal trouble. And what these two lawyers were trying to answer is, why did this group of low-income kids who come from a very stressed neighborhood, why did they not get into trouble when their peers did? And those two studies got merged together. So you have this very elite group of people, and then you have this very stressed, low socioeconomic group of people. And since then, the spouses have been enrolled in the studies, and the second generation has been enrolled in the studies. And what they've done in the studies is they do interviews. Every 1 or 2 years, they do lab tests every 1 or 2 years. The first thing that came out of the study that was totally unexpected is when they asked people what makes people happy, the first thing that came out is what's called meaningful social relationships. And this was a surprise and totally unexpected. And they started to look into it, and they found that and it has been supported. The conclusion has come up through other studies and has found the same thing. Meaningful social relationships are the things that really make people happy in the long run. There have been other studies who have come to the same conclusion. There was one study published in 2008 that was following people for 34 years. And what they found was when they compared the very happiest group of people to the least happiest group of people, the number of interactions with these different relatives, neighbors, and friends were clearly in favor of those who were very happy. And what they also found was in a study called the Multimorbidity and Social Participation Study is that happiness correlated with social activities, religious activities, or working in the community, reading a newspaper, and was inversely correlated with television. So meaningful social relationships turns out to be an incredibly important concept. The interesting thing is when people quit working, about 20% ultimately want to return to work. And when the Harvard study asked these people, why did they return to work? The most common reason was they missed the people at work, their friends. For men, they tend to lose their friendships much more significantly than women friendships. It turns out something like 2/3 of the friendships are of the same gender. And most of the male friendships generate out of work. And that's because the male type of friendship is different than the female type of friendship. The male type of friendship is what they refer to as side by side. They're joint activities you're doing together. You're playing golf together, you're playing basketball together, you're doing an activity. Whereas female friendships are face to face. They sit down and talk. And as a result, these relationships, women to women, are much more supportive because there's an emotional component that is absent from the male friendships. And so the female relationships are much more durable than the male social relationships. And then what happens is when the men start to lose their friends from work, they piggyback on top of the women's social relationships, and that creates new problems for the woman. I tried to find some data proving that the number of meaningful social relationships was lower for men and for women, and I really couldn't find data to back that up. So I then went looking for data about loneliness, saying, okay, that will be a surrogate. And the data on loneliness is very inconsistent. There was one study that came out from the National Academy of Science in 2020 that concluded loneliness are similar, the amount of loneliness are similar for men and for women. There was another study that came out also in 2020, not quite of the stature of National Academy of Science, but a respected study that said loneliness was a more significant problem for men than women. So I don't really know. I don't have the data to say that men have fewer social relations, but from when I talk to people, which is totally anecdote, that's my guess. That is this conclusion that men lose more social relationships than women is in fact correct. So we talked about meaningful social relationships, and besides it correlating with happiness, multiple other studies showed that absence of meaningful social relationships correlated with depression, more social relations correlated with a greater sense of purpose in life, and all these other favorable traits, including better cardiometabolic health over the succeeding decade, fewer heart disease events over the succeeding decade. So this was really a little bit surprising. Just based on the number of close friends you have, you're less likely to have heart disease, less likely to have cognitive function, thinking problems. So I thought that this was really remarkable. This is a quote from Kurt Vonnegut. I'm just going to paraphrase it. This was from '78, from a lecture he gave at a commencement. We were meant to live in an extended family. Do what you can to get yourself extended families, no matter how arbitrary they may be. They do not have to be high-grade people either. They can be imbeciles. What matters is numbers. I'm not going to review this slide, but these are links at the bottom where you can fill out forms to assess your how your meaningful social relationships quantify on others. This reference here, The Good Life, is a book by the current two lead investigators for the Harvard longevity study. It's called The Good Life, Lessons from the World's Longest Scientific Study of Happiness. So when we started all this, what I said was that I wanted to figure out a plan so I had a happy, healthy, and fulfilling retirement based on objective data. And what we just learned from the data that I presented is having a large number of meaningful social relationships has real benefits, objective benefits, better happiness, cognitive health, mental health, physical health, longevity, and a sense of fulfillment. So this is going to be the first objective on the strategic retirement plan. Quality is more important than quantity, but both of them are important. Strategic retirement plan, first evidence-based objective, lots of close friends who you can really talk to. The next thing the Harvard study found was having what they called a purpose and meaning in life correlated with happiness. And I feel like I need to define what it means to say you have a sense of purpose and meaning in life. Some of the people say it has to involve sacrifice, doing good for others, striving to be a better person. Aristotle and Plato, I don't remember who actually said this, or they didn't say it. The people who are interpreting what they said have said this, that to have a meaningful and purposeful life, you need to develop good character, fulfill our nature as rational beings in the pursuit of knowledge and virtue. But if you look at these other definitions, they're really all over the place. And what I came to believe, and the definition that works for me, is the individual believes that they have lived a life which meets their own expectations and gives them a reason to wake up in the morning and go another day. All right. It's not like somebody this isn't the national definition. Everybody's got to create their own definition. And maybe if your life is dedicated to robbing banks, your definition is going to be very different than if you're a physician. So the Harvard study said having a meaning, purpose in life correlates with happiness. So this was a study where they followed people who came into the study in their 50s, and it was published in JAMA. And when they came into this study, they broke down the people based on a questionnaire of do they have a purpose in life. And then they just did what's called a Kaplan-Meier curve or a survival curve. So at the beginning, 101 or 100% of people are alive. Okay, and with time, over the succeeding months or years, people start to die. So the number of people alive decreases. At the beginning of the study, everybody did it for them, and the psychologist said this person scores very high on purpose and meaning in life. This one is a little bit lower, and this is the lowest. And what you can see is, as you get out, these curves nicely stratify, meaning that if you have a lot of purpose and meaning in your life and you score high in those parameters, you're much more likely to be alive some years out. All right. Now, somebody who comes from the hard sciences, never would have occurred to me that this was the case. All right. But that's what the data shows. Now, there's all sorts of nuances. You could say, well, if you have a fatal disease, maybe you have no purpose and meaning in life, and that's why you score low, and that's why you die sooner. That's not dealt with in the data, but it is an interesting observation. The second point is there's also data for having a sense of purpose and meaning, and the benefits that accrue from that, if you have a sense of purpose and meaning in life, is you're happier, there's fewer psychiatric problems, cardiovascular health, longevity, and there's a sense of fulfillment. So those are the first two things, and there's science to support all those conclusions. So that's the second objective, evidence-based objective on my strategic retirement plan. Physical activity has been shown to correlate with happiness as well. And there are lots of studies on this. This is probably a systemic review, yeah. And what they found is a clear correlation between physical activity and happiness. And as little as 10 minutes of physical activity per week one day of exercise increases the level of happiness. The more you do, the greater your happiness. All right, so this is an example of one of these studies. It's a small study. So there's one group going to the gym, one group that's about to start going to the gym, and the control group who is definitely not going to the gym. And at the baseline, they measured the happiness in these people in these three groups. And what they found was that physical activity led to people being happier, and the benefit correlated with the amount of physical activity. So the people who had the most physical activity, whether measured in intensity or in duration, were happier than the people who didn't have the physical activity. What this study did was they defined these low risk factors. We're used to thinking of high risk factors. Smoking is a high risk factor, obesity, these are low risk factors. Never smoked, not overweight, exercises a lot, doesn't drink too much, and a very healthy diet score. They looked at the years of longevity based on these risk factors. If you compare the people who have all the healthy habits to the people who have none of the healthy habits, at age 50, a woman will live 14 more years and a male will live 12 more years. At age 70, women who have all the healthy habits will live 12 more years, men will live 9 more years. Now, I once looked into the data about exercising, and maybe everybody knows this, but if you exercise regularly, you will live longer. It turns out the amount of time you live longer works out to about the amount of time you spent exercising. So this is an interesting chart to sit down and look at, because if you have some bad habits, you can, on the bottom graph, so this is females and this is males. I know you can't read it, but you can say if you have all bad habits, if you have all of these bad habits and you say, okay, I'm going to stop one of these bad habits, I'm going to stop smoking, you can see at each age, at age 50, you gain about 2 years. At age 75, you gain maybe a year. If you decide at age 60, you're going to stop 2 of these bad habits, you may gain 9 years of life. So you can actually look through this and say, okay, I've got these bad habits. What's going to be the impact on my longevity, statistically speaking, if I make these changes? And I thought that was really a cool bit of data. So this is another study about physical activity, risk factors, and longevity. And this one is kind of cool as well. So for women, this is the nurses' health study, and this is the physician health study. Baseline, the women were age 60, and what they found was high levels of physical activity, which they defined as walking, are associated with exceptional health status in older age. So if at age 60, you are basically healthy, and you begin walking 30 minutes, 3 days a week or something like that, your chances of living to a very old age without developing health problems is markedly increased. Okay. The graph on the left, the chart on the left, tells you for each bad habit, what is your expected longevity. Disability-free longevity is how many years of life do you have left before something happens that gets defined as a disability. And disability for this purpose is you have problems managing your own money, problems dressing, problems walking across the room, using a toilet, using a map, preparing a hot meal, shopping for groceries, making phone calls, eating, taking medicines, getting in and out of bed. Those would all be considered disabilities. And the risk factors that we're looking at is too much alcohol, obesity, smoking, and inactivity. So you can look at this and say, well, at age 50, if I have none of these bad risk factors, a man will live disability-free for 32 years, a woman for 34 years. On the other hand, if you're smoking and you're not physically active, the man, instead of living for 32 years from age 50, will only live 21 years. And this is the data for 60 and 70. And again, it's a nice chart, which people don't really think about the data like this, but the data is out there. Disability-free life expectancy, again, the same data presented in a slightly different way as a function of age. So physical activity delays the development of disabilities and chronic diseases. This was a remarkable study. It was a meta-analysis of 143 studies looking at 100 health outcomes. And what question they were asking was, does exposure to green space have health benefits, i.e., just having a park that you can walk around in? And the answer is it does. The diastolic blood pressure is lower. That's the bottom number. It's 150 over 70. The 70 would be the diastolic blood pressure. Heart rates are lower. Salivary cortisol levels, if you have exposure to green space, are lower. Cortisol is a hormone made by the body typically in response to stress. 28% decreased risk of type 2 diabetes, adult diabetes, 31% decrease overall mortality, 16% decrease in cardiovascular mortality. And there are other benefits for stroke, asthma, cancer, and other things. So this to me is a really good study because it's a huge study. I think they're talking about getting out and walking amongst the trees, or walking through a park. The first study was, does exposure to nature, to green space or nature, have the benefit? And the answer is it does. Now, the next question is, if you're going to exercise, should you exercise out amongst nature or should you exercise indoors? We know exercise has mortality health benefits. From being outdoors, there are health benefits. So is it better to exercise indoors versus outdoors? And these were two good studies. And they basically said, yes, exercising outdoors is better than exercising indoors. So not exercising is bad. Exercising indoors is good. Exercising in urban setting outdoors is better. And you're going to see in a second, exercising outdoors in green space is even better. So this is an example of a smaller study. This was done, I think, at Stanford. And what they did is 38 people were enrolled in the study. They went for a 90-minute walk. One group was told to walk down a main street in Stanford and then turn around and come back. The other was told to walk through the Stanford grasslands. And then when they came back, those who walked in the natural environment had lower levels of what they called negative thoughts. And when they did these brain scans, they had activity in the brain that was linked to mental illness at a lower level than the people who walked in the urban environment. So the results suggest that exercising in natural areas may be vital for mental health, and it's better to exercise in green space than it is in urban space. And this was published in PNAS, so that's highly reputable. My complaint about a study like this is it's only 38 people, and these psychological surveys of lower risk, lower levels of negative thoughts, and it's transient, but it's an interesting anecdote. So if you have for your exercise, yes, you need to exercise. And if you have the option, you want to exercise outdoors in green space. The reason, so I want to talk a little bit about dementia, and then we're going to put a lot of this together. So these are the risks presented to people with dementia as a function of age. And this is recent data that was published in JAMA. This is the percentage of people with mild cognitive impairment. And about 10% or 15% a year that have mild cognitive impairment will progress to dementia eventually. And I think the total number is probably 60% over the next 7 years goes from cognitive impairment to dementia. So having this diagnosis doesn't mean you're going to get dementia. And the way this diagnosis is made, there's a series of questions the doc who's already harried asked you. I'm not sure what the reproducibility of the data is. It's not a great tool, but that's what we got. In England, they did a big study. It was published in Lancet, Dementia Prevention and Intervention and Care, published in 2020. And they were looking for what were the risk factors of dementia. And what they found was uncontrolled high blood pressure, hearing impairment, smoking, obesity, depression, physical inactivity, diabetes, social isolation, too much alcohol, lower education, head injury, air pollution. So the last three of these cannot be altered for somebody, in later life. The others can. The number in the parentheses is what would be the percent reduction of the number of people, percentage of people who have dementia if this problem went away. So if nobody drank alcohol, too much alcohol, that would reduce the total incidence of dementia by about 1%. So the question is, what can you do to prevent dementia? And right now, there isn't any way to stop people who have early dementia from the disease progressing. Okay. Now, I'm going to give you a study that says otherwise, but this is what the experts are going to tell you. This study looked for what cognitive activities, if any, would reduce the risk of getting dementia. All right. And what they found was these activities that I listed, and I'll read them because you probably can't see them, had a slight reduction of 7 to 11%. So we're not talking about a 60% reduction of getting dementia. It's a small number. But the things were broadly classified as adult literacy, writing letters or journaling, using a computer. Someone asked about email, taking education classes, active mental activities, playing games, cards, chess, crossword puzzles, passive mental activities, reading newspapers, magazines, books, and listening to music or the radio, and creative activities, woodworking, painting, metalwork, drawing. And the conclusion of the study that was the largest association with reduced risk of dementia involved critical thinking, logical reasoning, and social interactions. Again, meaningful social relationships. So in terms of exercise and cognitive function, every physician will tell people who have mild cognitive impairment that they should exercise. These are studies that supposedly show that physical activity can slow memory loss, and this was the same thing. What I wanted to point out is the wording that the paper includes. Support the plausibility is not like a Nobel Prize winning finding. All right, suggest, might have a positive impact. So the people who are doing these studies are really looking to try to show, yes, you should get out and exercise and it will help. And when I was a physician, I told everybody to do these things, but I also know the data is not there. But there are other reasons to do it. So everybody should get out and exercise, and guidelines now are 150 minutes a week. And it doesn't matter how you break that up. You can do 75 minutes twice a week, 50 minutes 3 times a week, 30 minutes 5 times a week, 22 minutes every day, 11 minutes twice a day. It doesn't matter how you break it up. And you just have to go for a walk. The longer you exercise, the data is, the better. The more vigorous, the better, but it's never too late to begin. The last group of studies showed engaging in physical activity, preferably outside in nature, has health benefits, cognitive function, mental health benefits, thinking, cognitive thinking function, physical benefits, improves longevity, and gives a sense of fulfillment. So now we've got 3 objectives on our list. Volunteering is really interesting. Volunteering has innumerable benefits. Mortality benefits, disability, reduction in disability, happiness, improved quality of life, lower depression levels, having a sense of purpose. People who do volunteer work are physically more active and they have more social connectedness. And this was a good study that sort of answered, that showed that when people volunteer, their hormones change. Dopamine levels go up, oxytocin goes up. The net effect is a reduction in blood pressure, reduction in inflammation, reduction in anxiety, fear. And I'm going to show you in the next slide, the rate of DNA aging goes down. And this is really remarkable. I'll do that in the next slide. The important caveat is we're talking about altruistic versus non-altruistic volunteering. When people do this altruistic volunteering, all of these hormonal physiologic changes happen. If somebody is doing volunteer work because their spouse said you need to go to the shelter and feed those people and you got to be there for 2 hours, that person is not going to be in a great frame of mind, and these hormone changes are not going to happen. And as a result, they don't get all those health benefits that are shown on the slide on the left. So we're talking about people who are volunteering because they really want to. Again, we're trying to create a strategic retirement plan to have a happy, healthy, and fulfilling retirement. Meaningful social relationships on the list, purpose and meaning, physical activity, altruistic volunteering. And for altruistic volunteering, the benefits that accrue are happiness, mental health benefits, physical longevity, and fulfillment. It used to be believed that if you earned up to your happiness increased up to a salary of 75, income up to $75,000 a year, and any incremental income above that, you weren't happier. All right. And that study was done by a guy named Daniel Kahneman, who recently died, who's a psychologist, was a psychologist at Princeton. And both of these guys, Kahneman and Deaton at Princeton, both won Nobel laureates in economics. But that was the dogma. Once you get to 75,000, more money doesn't make you happier. In the second study, which happened in 2021, this guy, also at Princeton, also published in Proceedings National Academy of Science, found that as the income went up, people got happier. And there was no threshold, which at that time in 2021 was $100,000 a year. In a remarkable, perfect academic symbiosis, these two guys got together and said, we'll bring in a third person and we're going to figure out why we got different answers. I mean, this doesn't happen in medicine, but this is how it's supposed to work. And what they found was that basically everybody, and then they broke the group down based on how happy you are. This is the happiest group. This is the average happy group. This is the least happy group. This is the $100,000 line. And on the y-axis is happiness. So for people who are extremely happy, as their income gets up to 100,000, they get happier, and then they still get happier when it goes up. The only group that didn't happen with is people who were in the least happy group. They got happier once their income got up to 100,000, but you give them more money and they didn't get happier. All right. And that was the difference in these two studies. So we now know, basically, for most people, 85% of the people, more income makes you happier. Once you get up to $100,000, you can afford to feed yourself and your family, and you can feed your kids. And if you're basically an unhappy person, getting more money doesn't solve it. So more money makes you happy. However, how you spend your money turns out to be very, very important. If you want to be happy, the data is spend your money on experiences, not objects. Spend your money on shared experiences will make you happier than on solo experiences. So I will have a whole lot more fun if I go on a trip with my wife than if I go alone. Same with a movie, same to the museum. If you want to spend your money on what they call either active and mentally engaging leisure activities, and use your money to promote social interaction, more interactions to promote that meaningful social relationships, and spend your money to acquire free time. If you don't want to, if you have the disposable income, get somebody to clean the house and then use that time to go out and socialize with some close friends. If you want to spend money on others, do it in face-to-face interactions, spend it on family and friends, make charitable contributions if you are sure that it really is going to make a difference, but don't do it just because out of guilt. Get a new phone or a new car, and it's like, oh, this is really cool, and that lasts 6 months, and then it's just another item. And that's called hedonic adaptation. And what happens is people then say, okay, well, the new car was cool for a while. I got to get something else. And they get on this, what's called hedonic treadmill. This is how you break that cycle, how to get off the hedonic treadmill. So this is the next thing we're going to add to our strategic retirement plan. Invest your money to promote happiness long-term. I'm going to talk a little bit about happiness. So this is mostly from a course that's online, Managing Happiness by a guy named Arthur Brooks. He's at Harvard Business School. He writes for The Atlantic about happiness. There's a whole literature about happiness. And the psychologists define happiness as enjoyment. Some component is from enjoyment, satisfaction, and meaning. And enjoyment is the result of pleasure, which is happiness in the moment. Appreciation and knowledge, which is happiness that is more long-term. You do something and you feel better about it long-term. Satisfaction is what you have divided by what you want. So you could be more satisfied by buying more stuff, have more things. Or you can just say, you know what, I don't really need that second car. I don't need a third house or whatever it is. And happiness, meaning. Having a meaning in your life is part of the component of happiness. The psychologists say half of it is genetics, and they get that from the genetic studies. A quarter of it is circumstances, and a quarter of it is habits. Okay. The problem is you can't fix your genetics. You can't really fix your circumstances. So the only way you really can affect your happiness is through your habits. And habits are amenable to change. The social sciences show us, I think there's a slide later on, that the way to change habits is either you have to create friction, or you have to replace one habit with a better habit. For example, there was a guy, and this is a true story, who was a research scientist, and he found that 10 o'clock every day, he went down to the cafeteria, got himself a muffin, and sat down with his colleagues and ate it. And he was trying to lose weight, and it's like, why did I do that? And that went on over and over again. Well, he created a series of hypotheses as to why he did it. I need a sugar fix. I want to hang out with these people. I need to get out of my office. I forgot what they all were. And then he proceeded to create experiments to solve each of those. And what he found was he didn't need a sugar fix, because if he ate the donut in his office, he still wanted to go down to the cafeteria. It turns out he just had to walk into a colleague's office and sit down and talk at 10 o'clock. And so he replaced one bad habit with a good habit. And that's one way of changing habits. Because if you try to rely on willpower, all the data is it's not going to work. This is what's called the General Social Survey, which is done at University of Chicago every year. And what they've concluded in their surveys over and over again is being married is the most important determinant of happiness. Having more income is the second most important. And these other things, although they do affect happiness, are much, much less important. So this is what's called a happiness curve. So on the x-axis, you have age. On the y-axis, you have measure of happiness. And the blue line is if you measure people's happiness as a function of age. And there's a low point. So you start out happy at 18, 25 is a low point, then you get happier. And then you start to get unhappier around 52, and then you get happy for the rest of your life. Okay, so that's the data from the US. Now, so then what you do is from that, there are certain things that we know affect our happiness. And what they do is they correct the data for that. So in the US, the confounding variables that affect happiness are marital status, education level, employment. But those three things independently affect our happiness. What they do is they correct the data and take that information out. And what they get is this U-shaped curve. And the reason they take out these confounding variables is in different countries, in different cultures, there are different confounding variables. And to try to compare one country to the other, you got to remove the confounding variables. Once you remove the confounding variables, all the countries of the world have this U-shaped curve. All right, you start out happy, midlife, you're not so happy, and the rest of life, you get happier. And not only is it seen in all the cultures of the world, it's seen in zoo animals also. So this is sort of a fundamental factor of being a human. I think for the sake of time, we're going to skip happiness and anatomy, and we'll come back to some of this, but we're going to skip that for the sake of time. Oxytocin is an important hormone. We make it in response to certain activities, and it's considered a pro-social hormone. It makes us feel better. We relax, we trust other people, improve psychological stability, we feel more love, reduction in anxiety and fear. And these are the things you can do to boost your oxytocin levels. Right? So I get my dose of oxytocin, I sit down and I snuggle my dog periodically. I was telling you before, happiness has a physiologic basis. So this is a really cool study. There are two types of happiness, hedonic happiness and eudaimonic happiness. Hedonic happiness is associated with these things. I'm a taker, I'm present-oriented. It would be like, I want to go out and ride my motorcycle real fast. That's hedonic happiness. Okay? As opposed to eudaimonic happiness, which is, I want to do something that will make the world a better place. So hedonic is I'm a taker, eudaimonic is I'm a giver. Hedonic is right now I want to be happy, the eudaimonic, I want to think about it in the long run. So this is a cool study in which they took a group of patients and they had them do surveys, psychological surveys. And so they measured how much hedonic happiness they had and how much eudaimonic happiness they had, okay? And then they looked at the activity of a certain set of genes called CTRA. And when the CTRA genes are very active, it has adverse health effects. inflammation is increased, certain diseases are increased, heart disease is increased, cancer risk is increased, risk of viral infection goes up. Turns out the people who measured really high on the hedonic happiness scale, their CTRA genes were ramped up in activity, which would predict that they are going to have worse health outcomes. The people who had the eudaimonic, or who had a high score in eudaimonic happiness, was just the reverse. And to me, this is fascinating to see a social measure actually being obvious at the activity of DNA. Now, the authors went on to say, well, we should tell people who measure high in hedonic happiness, they'll live longer if we can get them to be more like value, meaning, and purpose, and more eudaimonic, and then they'll have fewer health problems. That anybody who knows medicine, that's a stretch. That's a hypothesis. That's not a proof. But I thought that this was just so amazing to see the psychology stuff wrapped into real hard physiology. We've talked about these things that we needed to do to get us closer to a happy, healthy, and fulfilling retirement. In the psychology world, there's something called positive psychology, and there are several different techniques they have that will make you happier. And one of the techniques is called the hope circuit, and there's hard science on this. And what it says is, if something bad happens to you, if you can create some positive thoughts, that can block the total impact of the negative situation that you're in. Okay. Opposite signal strategy is basically, if you have a bad situation, you should try to learn to redirect these bad behaviors in a way that is helpful for you. For example, if you get frustrated and you typically get into a fight with your spouse, go for a walk in nature or something like that. And disputation strategy says that when bad things happen, the first thing to remember is when we get pessimistic, we get a much more dour outlook, and we tend to awfulize the situation. So the disputation strategy is to remember when bad things happen, usually these bad things are temporary, and you have to remind yourself of that. And the last one we're not going to talk about because there's no data on it. So these are ways of hacking your brain to make you happier. And again, these are all on the links. There'll be on my document, there'll be links to all of this stuff. Other ways to hack your brain for happiness. Creating a gratitude journal has been shown to reinforce positive, you can use to reinforce positive experiences and will make you feel happier. We talked about oxytocin and just getting your dog and hugging your dog, hugging your friend, engaging in social interactions. The last one that I want to mention is what's called post-traumatic growth. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. This one, let me see that one more slide. Post-traumatic growth is you have a bad experience, and what the data shows is people who have bad experiences, although it's horrible at the time, grow and develop more meaning and purpose in their life as a result of that experience. And a quick example I can give you was in one of the books I read, a psychologist leads a VA post-traumatic stress disorder meeting. So he goes into the meeting, he's a young psychologist, and these vets are talking, and he's saying, I can't really help these people. And what he comes to the conclusion is they are helping themselves. Because they've had these horrible experiences, they are uniquely able to have insights that can help each other. So let's go back. So we've got all these evidence-based objectives. I'm going to skip that. We talked about that. Last thing is so we have this strategic retirement plan. Now we have to add our personal objectives. And for me, what I did is I kept an online diary. And what I discovered from my online diary is a good day for me would mean some meaningful social interactions, exercise, learning something, an absence of certain types of stresses, making or repairing something, and that I had an interest in the secular spiritual world, and I wanted to learn how to have more meaningful conversations. With that, now I have my entire strategic retirement plan. I've got all of those that we talked about, and these are the ones that I've added as personal to me. Yours will be different. Yours will not look like this. This part will be the same, but this will be different. Now I need a I need to figure out how am I going to implement all of this. And the first thing to remember is Daniel Gilbert, who's a psychologist at Harvard, who I mentioned earlier, has a statement. And the bottom line is human beings are works in progress that mistakenly think they're finished. We change as we get older. All right. And the reason I put that up is, as we're going to see in a second, keep this in mind. And it's a reason to try stuff that you haven't tried before. And we'll come back to that. So the first thing in my retirement plan was augment the number of meetings, close social relationships. So what did I do to do that? Well, I tried the Somerville Council on the Aging, the weekly senior walks, and the monthly men's talking group. That didn't work for me. I created a retired elderly men's brunch. We meet once a month. There are 5 of us, and usually we get 3 of us in attendance. My wife and I went to MIT, so we attend the social events and the lectures there. I created what I call a shoot the shit salon for the summer months. We did it last year, and we send out an email on Wednesday. We say we're going to have a shoot the shit salon in our backyard, 5:30 on Friday. We will supply fruit, vegetables, and if you want to bring alcohol or any other indulgence to share, do it. And we did that. I created a pickleball league for alumni at MIT. There's something called the train experiment, talk to strangers. And this is a cool experiment where a social psychologist talked to people before they got on the train, divided them into 2 groups. One group was told that they should talk to the person next to them on the train and try to have a conversation. And the other was just told, we're going to interview you at the end. At the end of the train ride, they interviewed both groups. And overwhelmingly, the person who talked to the stranger said, I'm going to do this from now on. It made it a more meaningful. So I've taken to do that. And it definitely works. So these are some of the things that I've done with ideas for the future. The other thing that is important is intergenerational engagement is really, really important. So if you can figure out a way to work that in, it's good all around. So, the MIT Social Club, we're amongst the oldest, not always, the shit salon in our neighborhood. People range in age from probably early 30s to 70. Anyway, so that's number one. This is not solved for me yet, but I'm working on it. Your tactical plan is not always going to work. Leonardo da Vinci, if the above effect is not obtained, waste no more time on it. Move on. And that's what I do. How did I define my sense of purpose? Well, from reading my diary, what I discovered is, for me, creating something that engages others emotionally, intellectually, or is somehow valued by others gives me a real sense of reward. I built some sculptures on the Somerville Community Path, and when people look at them and I see that they're intellectually engaged or they say it looks cool, that makes me feel great. I have a blog that I write on, and when I write an essay, I send out to my readership, and I'll get comments back. Sometimes I get nothing back, which means nobody agreed with me, which is fine. But sometimes I get comments back, and it makes me feel like I've at least got people thinking. And then putting this whole series together, all of this is the same idea. So that's my purpose in life. You've got to come up with your own. And the thing is, you got to think about your strengths, your weaknesses, your obstacles in life. Volunteering, join a club, gratitude journey. Ask your friends, just say yes to every opportunity. Prototype activities that are outside your comfort zone, or just Google it. Physical activities, I'm not going to go through this, but I cycle regularly down the Minuteman Bike Trail, and that's easy to do. Go for a walk. And there's links here for people who want to exercise from the National Institute of Health of how to do exercise for various ages. Participate in altruistic activities. We talked about this. I'm not really doing any altruistic activities other than I find that my purpose in life of trying to bring either joy or curiosity to others, for me, is somewhat a volunteer activity. We talked about investing your money in ways that maximize happiness. We talked about hacking your brain, and there are different ways. We talked about these different techniques. We talked about how you can alter your environment to change your behavior by creating different, new, better habit to take over a bad habit. And remember, happiness is a function of pleasure, appreciation, knowledge, what you have divided by what you want. There are different ways to make yourself happier. Um, Now we move to my strategic plan, that is personal to me, engaging in intellectual activities. So I do all of these things. I avoid certain conversations and certain people just because it makes me feel miserable. I don't need that. Um, I discovered, that I talked about creative activities. Overcoming inertia is a really important one. The This is true of both Gail, my wife, who does painting, and myself. Sometimes it's like hard to get started on these projects. And what I've discovered for me is if I can lower my expectations as to what I'm going to accomplish, then I can get myself to do it. So, for example, my woodworking shop is in the basement. I may be in the middle of a project, and I know the next step is going to take a couple of hours. And I want to do it, but I can't get myself to go. And I'll say, okay, just go down, sweep the floor, clean up in preparation for it. And before you know it, I've done that and I'm active. So I just have to change my mindset. The next thing on my plan is I want to explore the secular spiritual world. I tried meditation, it didn't work for me. And I think that's because for me, meditation, cycling is my meditation. I do want to do hallucinogenics down the road. We're not going to talk about that. Next important thing is deliberative scheduling. I mentioned Arthur Brooks, who writes for The Atlantic and teaches a course at Harvard Business School about happiness. Happiness requires a conscious focus on your relationships, and I would extend that to me scheduling your activities. If you don't spend time scheduling your activities consciously, you're going to find holes in your calendar and nothing to do. First thing I do when I get up and grab a cup of coffee, I check my email to see, okay, what activities do I have today and what can I add from the emails that have come in or what I've learned. We talked about how creating new habits requires you not to rely on willpower, but changing the environment, creating friction. So you replace one habit with another, and then you can actually create these new habits. Final slide. So designing retirement, we talked about these strategic retirement plans, meaningful social relationships, purpose in meeting, physical activity, preferably in nature, volunteer work, invest your money wisely, hack your brain to make yourself happy. Then, so that this will apply to everybody because this is the data from large studies or from general population. Then you got to customize that with whatever your personal interests and priorities are. You're not listing here, I want to go to Italy. That's not an objective. You may want to list, I need to see the world. That's important to me. So these are big, high level things. Then after you've got your strategic retirement plan, then you create tactical plans. And you sit down and say, okay, what can I do to make this objective happen? And 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 you need to be flexible. As Dan Gilbert says, humans are a work in progress that mistakenly think they're finished. You're going to change with time. Your health is going to change with time. So your strategic retirement plan may change with time, as may your tactical plan. So you have to be flexible about all of this. These are articles on my blog about retirement and my experience with retirement. So, final story. I created a mantra when I started my retirement. It is now my time. I took care of my patients, when I was a professional, and I took care of my kids. I didn't feel like I had real control of my life. I had these responsibilities that had to be taken care of. And I decided in retirement, it's going to be my time. I'm going to do what I want from here on in. My son calls me. He lives in Napa, California. He wants me to build him a birdhouse. He and his wife have a beautiful house. And I was like, Calder, I'm not building a birdhouse. I don't want to do it. Well, you build me a birdhouse. It'll only take you 30 minutes. Calder, it won't take 30 minutes, but that's not the issue. I don't want to do it. This goes on for a while. I say, it's now my time. I'm not doing it. I'm only doing stuff that I really want to do. Anyway, 8 months ago, our granddaughter was born. And he says to me, well, what happens if Josie asks you for a birdhouse? And I said to him, Calder, Josie and I will have a conversation, and she and I will decide that we'll build the birdhouse together. And if she wants to give it to you, that's up to her.